going to go through this book just by way of introduction. My name is Rabbi Akiva Rosenblatt. I'm the rabbi at Hadley Wood Jewish Community. A bit closer to Essex than all of you, but not close enough to pick up those books, I'm afraid. Hadley Wood is Barnet area, near Southgate, Cockfosters, for those of you that are familiar with the area. Nice little community. If you ever come past, feel free to pop in and say hi. So you are all doing Shabbat together, and we're up to the chapter that Rabbi Birnbaum has sent me. Sheet 1 is on my phone. I'm going to read it from my phone, so you may not see me, but I'm very much with you. And I think, as far as I understand, the way this is done is you kind of read out loud. You've got the text in front of you, and then just gives a bit of peppers it with a bit of his own ideas as we go along, if that makes sense. Is that right? Yeah? Okay. So, Belinda, should I jump straight in over here?
Go for it. Thank you.
Okay. Fine, no problem, no problem. So I love this parable, which it starts with. You can still hear me, right?
Yep.
Yep, okay.
Yeah.
Consider the following parable, crafted by the Dubner Maggid, the great 18th century rabbi, famous for enlivening deep philosophical ideas through colorful yet profound imagery. That's just a fancy way of saying parable. A poor man is traveling along the road carrying a heavy bag. Along comes a wealthy nobleman in a carriage drawn by horses and offers a lift to the traveler, who accepts and climbs into the carriage. A short while later, the owner of the carriage notices that his new passenger is sitting with his heavy bag still on his shoulders. He says to him, "Why are you still carrying your bag? Why didn't you put it down?" The traveler answers, "I feel bad enough that you stopped to give me a lift and your horses have the extra burden of my weight. The least I can do is carry my own bag." Of course, the nobleman explains, "Don't be silly. The horses are carrying you and your burdens anyway." It's a ridiculous concept of him carrying the bags as if that's going to take the burden off the horses. He's saying this because what he wants to share is what this chapter is called trusting. On Shabbat, we remind ourselves that God carries us. We don't carry our burdens on our own. That's a beautiful parable. Beautiful parable. You know, we think we're carrying our own burdens, but God is carrying us and our burdens, a bit like that carriage. And on Shabbat, we can put them down. Faith in God, a foundational mitzvah, is brought into focus on Shabbat. We acknowledge Hashem, God, as the creator of the world, who took us out of Egypt and guides our destiny. I think you'll see me back on Zoom now. We transform faith from an intellectual understanding that God is in control into trust, a feeling of security and confidence. That is a beautiful concept of Shabbat, and one which I think, especially in these times, is all the more relevant and all the more important. It's that there is so much anxiety and worry and almost, for some, a feeling of almost helplessness or hopelessness. You know, how do we get through this? And during the week, it is our job, it is our role to try and make a difference. We are created in the image of God, and we are created to be partners with God in making this world a better place. And that is our role in this world during the week. However, Shabbat comes along and we switch off. Shabbat comes along and we kind of unload. We take off those burdens from our back and we say, "You know what, God, I'm going to let go and let God." And that is what we do on Shabbat. And there is that faith and confidence in the fact that the world will be okay. The world will be okay because God is in control. It doesn't always feel that way, and it's not always easy to feel. But Shabbat is an opportunity for us to try and tap into that feeling. So this trust does not mean we believe everything is going to turn out exactly the way we want. Rather, it is the understanding that everything that happens in our lives is part of God's plan. Whether we experience pain or pleasure, triumph or failure, abundance or scarcity, is all part of God's plan for providing us with the experiences we need to fulfill our ultimate potential. As the Talmud puts it, Gam zu l'tova, which is this too is for the good. In being able to respond to life's, gosh, this is a nice word over here, vicissitudes. There is great comfort in knowing that life is not random, that God is in control and carrying us. So sometimes we look at the world and we see chaos. Sometimes we look at the world and think, where is God? You know, it doesn't seem to, the world doesn't seem to be functioning the way that it should or the way that it could. Shabbat is one day a week where we kind of switch off from that way of thinking and recognize that sometimes we're missing it, that sometimes we think we know the way things should be. We think we know the way the world should work. You know, if I were God, the world would look like this. But on Shabbat, we remember that actually there is much more than there meets the eye. And although things may look extremely chaotic and may seem bad, Gamzu Latova, this is too is for the good. Now, of course, it's easier said than done. And of course, we don't say this to other people who are going through pain and suffering. That's not our job to tell this to other people. But we can definitely think about it for ourselves in terms of our own challenges, our own struggles. We can look at our own struggles in that way. The psalm dedicated to Shabbat, we say Mizmor Shir Le'Yom HaShabbat, yeah, calls on us to tell of your kindness in the morning and your faithfulness at night. That's that verse. God cares for us in the bright optimism of the morning, times of ease, and during the dark nights, times of fear and uncertainty. On Shabbat, we feel that intensely. It is a day of trusting God. It is a day to recognize that our lives and our burdens are in God's hands. Now, he's talking about financial anxiety, which, of course, every one of us experiences in our own way. This applies particularly to the natural anxiety we have about having the financial means to meet our basic needs. Shabbat specifically tests our trust in God in this area. How so? Because it is a day on which we set aside our money-making endeavors. We switch off from work, 25 hours, where we stop trying to make money. Peace of mind on Shabbat is only possible with complete trust in God. We do our best to earn a living during the week, but we recognize that ultimately, whatever we earn is by the blessings of God, who is the source of everything in our lives. And therefore, we are, in a sense, God's salaried workers. On Shabbat, he gives us the day off, guaranteeing that our finances will not be affected and lifts the burden of our anxieties. What he's referring to over here, by the way, by saying guaranteeing that our finances will not be affected is, first of all, when it comes to Shabbat expenses, we are told that those aren't included in the budget, the God-given budget that we have for the year. We are told that on Rosh Hashanah, there is a kind of allowance that every single human being is given as to how much money they're going to earn that year, what their allowance is, so to speak, our pocket money for the year. The expenses of Shabbat are on the house. So what we spend on Shabbat, within reason, obviously, doesn't mean you go buy out Kosher Kingdom every week and God's going to just make sure the money, lands on your doorstep the next morning. But it does mean that within reason and with an element of responsibility, the money we spend on Shabbat is a separate budget. And number two, there is a special blessing that we ain't going to lose out from keeping Shabbat, meaning if we feel like we're going to lose work from it, and sometimes we do, in the long run, it will not be able to get in the way of our finances. There's no way. Keeping Shabbat is almost a guarantee that we won't lose out financially by keeping Shabbat. Okay, let's carry on. God taught us this lesson of trust soon after we left Egypt, when he introduced us to Shabbat, before we had even reached Sinai and received the Torah. Shabbat was one of the first mitzvot we received. I think we received it in a place called Mara. Mara was one of the places the Jewish people camped before we actually received the Torah itself. Soon after, we began receiving our daily sustenance in the wilderness in the form of manna or man. This miraculous food fell from the skies every morning, was preserved by dew until the people could gather it for their families. Fell daily in just the right quantity for that day. Those who tried to hoard extra manna for later found that it had rotted. So the Jewish people in the desert was an extreme form of trust, where they weren't even allowed to worry about what they would eat the next day. It was that there was such a trust in God, and there was such a spiritual, almost divine protection, that every day was faith in its own right. You were not allowed to collect manna for the next day, because that is, to a certain extent, a lack of trust in the fact that manna is going to fall the next day. So you've got to trust every day the manna is going to fall. The exception, however, was Friday. The Jewish people were told that 2 portions of manna per household would fall on Friday, so that they would have enough for Shabbat. They were told not to gather manna on Shabbat, a holy day. Instead, the manna collected on Friday remained perfectly fresh throughout Shabbat. This is why, I'm sure you knew this already, but this is why we place 2 challahs on the table at each meal, reminding us of the double portion of manna that fell on Friday for Shabbat. And one of the reasons we cover the bread is to remember the dew of the wilderness that protected the manna. By the way, we have a cover on top and underneath. we have the board itself, we have the challah cover, because we are told that the manna was covered underneath, so it wouldn't get dirty underneath, and also protected on top. I see some people don't always do this, but well, ideally, I think one's meant to make the blessing on the bread with the cover still on it, with the cover still on the bread. And some people take the cover off and then make the blessing. As far as I understand, the cover stays on for the bracha, for the blessing of the bread. It's just by the by. When the Torah says that God blessed the Shabbat, it refers to the blessing of the manna from heaven. I don't have footnote 17 here. I wonder where that comes from. Manna represents the trust the Jews in the wilderness had in God as they patiently waited for their sustenance from day to day. By instructing the people to gather a double portion on Friday and nothing on Shabbat, God was testing their willingness to respect the laws of Shabbat and to trust that he would provide. The manna was essentially a test of faith. Many generations later, the prophet Jeremiah called the people's attention to the jar of manna, which had been preserved as a symbol to future generations of what it means to have complete trust in God for one's sustenance. We say, by the way, we quote this verse in the Haftarah on Rosh Hashanah, and we also say in our prayers, our davening on Rosh Hashanah, Ka Amar Hashem, so said God, Zacharti lach chesed ne'urayich. I remember the kindness of your youth, referring to the Jewish people. The youth of the Jewish people is referring to their early days, i.e. their travels through the desert. Lech teich acharai b'midbar be'eretz lo zarua, where you followed after me in the desert in a barren land. And the Jewish people expressed a faith. This word has been overused recently, but it really was an unprecedented faith in God. Every single day was a faith in the fact that, don't worry, manna will fall. I see there's messages coming on the chat over here. Yes, my husband does it that way. Thank you, Debbie, for backing me up on that one. Okay, so each week, seeing the two challahs on our Shabbat tables, we remember how God provided for our people in the desert for 40 years, and that our own sustenance today is just as miraculous, that it comes from heaven, even if it doesn't fall out of the sky. Oh, that's a very beautiful line over there. We try to model our ancestors' serene faith, how despite being in the most vulnerable circumstances, they felt at peace, confident that God would look after them. So what he's trying to say is that the challah itself that we have on Shabbat is not just a tasty food, it's actually a symbol of faith. It's a symbol of faith. Matzah is a symbol of our slavery or freedom. Challah is a symbol of faith. Shabbat trains us to be trusting people, to trust God, to feel secure and confident that our lives are in his hands. It's not just about our concerns for sustenance, but, and this is particularly important, as I mentioned, in the current climate, every aspect of our well-being, including health, family, success, and safety, we rely on God for it all. Our aim is to carry this feeling of trust with us into the week, to let it infuse every part of our lives, every blessing we enjoy. We may no longer be wandering in the wilderness, but our future is equally unknown and unknowable, and fundamentally, we are just as vulnerable. If we would have read those sentences a month ago, we would have probably thought, well, we're quite safe and secure. How vulnerable are we already? But of course, there is a vulnerability the Jewish people is feeling right now. However, the vulnerability is an illusion. The vulnerability is an illusion. Ultimately, with God in the driver's seat, we are never unsafe, however unsafe it may look or feel. And by the way, I kind of glossed over that line, but that's an important line that he mentioned when he says that we're meant to carry that feeling of trust with us into the week. I've heard it said that Havdalah, to a certain extent, is an opportunity to reflect on the almost spiritual experience that we had on Shabbat and to not let it go. You know, we're making a divide between the holiness of Shabbat and the mundane of the week. But we don't want that to leave us. We don't want that feeling of godliness to leave us during the week. And the Shabbat's kind of meant to be a boost for the week. Each week, Shabbat instills in us trust in God to meet an uncertain future with confidence. This is reflected in a beautiful custom during the final moments of Shabbat, when we sing the words of Psalms chapter 23. This is a Psalm of David. The Lord is my shepherd, one of the most famous Psalms, which have provided comfort through the ages. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, for you are with me. Gam kelech begate salmavet lo ira. We sing that on a at third meal at Seuda, Shalashudas, whatever you call it. And then on Saturday night, as we venture out from the security of Shabbat into the unknowns of the week, we are fortified with a renewed faith in God instilled in us over the course of the day. Shabbat culminates with the confident declaration of the words of the prophet Isaiah. We proclaim as we introduce Havdalah, Hine Yeshuati. Behold, God is my salvation. I should trust and not fear, for God is my might and my praise. Eftach avchad ki aziv zimrat ka. And that basically is the chapter about what does he call this chapter again? Because I've lost page 1. What's the title of this chapter? With trusting? Can't remember. You're all muted. So trusting. Yeah, I was right. Trusting. Okay. I hope that was helpful. I hope people felt something over there in terms of what Shabbat has the opportunity to provide us with in terms of being trusting. I will say again, it's definitely easier said than done. However, the great thing about trusting is you don't have to do anything. You just have to let go. That's the weird thing. It's sort of the ironic thing about trust is that the hard thing about trust is not the doing, it's the not doing. It's the letting go of all that we kind of hold on to so tightly during the week. I must do this. Without me, the whole world would collapse. Without me, my financial security would, whatever it may be, we kind of me. And Shabbat is actually, no, it's God, 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 God.